Hey VC, my name's Harvey and welcome to the latest video upload for my channel Spinning the Black Circle. Today's topic is, what are the 20 essential albums to own on vinyl? So maybe you're getting into music and vinyl is your chosen format, or perhaps you have been investing in digital or CDs and you want to start or restock your vinyl collection, or maybe you're a connoisseur and are curious as to what I would consider the 20 essential albums. But maybe we'll start with what this is not. This is not a list of the 20 greatest albums ever made. There are plenty of opinions available online on that topic. I'd say, if that's your question, start with something like Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums ever made. So that's readily available online, Rolling Stone magazine, and you wouldn't have to subscribe to that. So that's one option. This is also not a list of my 20 personal favourites. So I love every one of these albums, otherwise I wouldn't have selected them, but it's not that. And also in terms of genres, it spans the contemporary rock and pop genres. So I would call that era 1962 to current date. I don't mean to ignore Elvis or Chuck Berry, but I want to keep it nice and simple. So let's say, what are the 20 essential albums to start a vinyl collection between 1962 and the current date. And really the purpose is, what's a good baseline collection in my opinion? You know, what's going to give you a good jump off point either for certain artists or certain subgenres, and that's what we're talking about. Finally, it's in roughly alphabetical order by artist, but please don't comment below that some of it isn't, because that's not the purpose of it. It's really just to have them in a rough alphabetical order, and the final selection is definitely not in alphabetical order. So then, let's get going. The first selection, no surprise that the Beatles feature. This is their 1964 album, A Hard Day's Night. Is it the best Beatles album? Possibly not. Why? But why is this a good first Beatles album, or why is it essential in terms of a starting collection? And that's because this captures the Beatles as the world fell at their feet. So released in 1964 as a soundtrack to the film of the same name. If you own this and also the Beatles' Long Tall Sally EP, you've got the perfect encapsulation of the Beatles when they just mastered the 2 to 3 minute pop tune. So remember, after this LP, they started to really push the boundaries and do some amazing things that no one had ever even thought of. But this captures, arguably the best there ever was. The 2 to 3 minute pop tune and the absolute mastery of that format, and that's why I think A Hard Day's Night would be one of your essential first purchases. What's next? So something completely different. It is a rap / hip hop album from 1989. Blimey, that's 30 years old, this album. That makes me feel really old. But this is Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys, and the reason I've selected this album is, so they were a bit of a joke act prior to this LP. Actually, they were huge. They had a hugely successful debut LP named License to Ill, but they came across as a bit of the kind of, the laughing boys of rap and hip hop, a bit of a boy band. But this is where their artistic intent really began to come through. It was produced by the Dust Brothers, and what it is really is a kind of canvas of sample based material that the Beastie Boys rap over. I don't know how many samples are on this LP, but it's famous for having a ton of samples on it, and it just works. And it's great music. So is it pure music? It's samples with 3 guys rapping over the top of it? No. But in terms of an artistic statement and something that will give you a fantastic jump off point for this genre, again, it's probably not the best. It's one of the best rap albums arguably ever made, but it's not the best in my opinion. It probably wouldn't come out as top on the list, but it's up there because it was pushing boundaries and it sounds great. And it was something new. So I think this is a good first rap album to own that will give you plenty of food for thought in terms of how to expand the rap collection. So Beastie Boys, Paul's Boutique, in my opinion, one of your 20 essential albums. What's next? Couldn't leave this chap out, not because of any critics list, but just because, in my opinion, he was a musical genius. So R.I.P. David Bowie, and this is his 1971 album Hunky Dory. So why this selection? Similar to the Beatles, I think this is when Bowie's genius, became clear. I think that artistically and in terms of the breadth of his musical palette, then Hunky Dory is where it really started to come into focus. So on here you have Changes, you have Life on Mars, Oh You Pretty Things. It's a cohesive set of albums. There's not one bad track on it. The production is absolutely huge. It includes orchestration. It is just the first blooming of an absolute genius, and that's why I think Hunky Dory would be a good first Bowie album, and certainly something that would feature in your 20 essential albums to own on vinyl. So Hunky Dory by Bowie would be number 3. What's next? Something again completely different. This is, I think, the most contemporary album on this list. It's from 2013 by the French electronic duo Daft Punk, and the album is called Random Access Memories. And the reason this is on the list is I think it's the last truly gargantuan album we'll ever see, in terms of how long it took them to record, how much it cost, and also the scale of the production on this thing. So it famously features lots of live musicians, despite the fact that these guys are an electronic duo. Nile Rodgers features on a number of these tracks. The big hit was Get Lucky, featuring Pharrell Williams. But it's just a mammoth album. It's so meticulously put together. It did take them literally years to make. In the studio, costs were easily into the millions, and it sounds like it. And also, more importantly, this will give you a good baseline for a lot of dance and electronic music. From here you should go back to Kraftwerk. Giorgio Moroder features on here. Go back to his work. Go back to actually some of Bowie's electronic stuff on albums like Low in the 70s. It might even take you back to Can in the 70s too. But I think in terms of a really contemporary album to feature in your 21st albums, then I think a good selection would be Random Access Memories by Daft Punk. It also, on vinyl, it's absolutely astonishing. It's a double album. It's audiophile quality in terms of how it's put together, really well mastered on Columbia Records. So yeah, a good selection in your first 20, I think. What's next? Quite an obvious one, but again, one I couldn't feasibly leave out, and that's Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits from either 1984 or 85. I forget which year. Famous for being one of the huge selling early CDs actually, but I think the vinyl version massively eclipses it. It was a massive album on any format, but it's Dire Straits are somewhat derided, as being a kind of boring middle of the road middle class band, but this is a sensational album. The title track is epic. Money for Nothing, which features Sting. That's a great system tester song, actually. Money for Nothing. It sounds huge. It'll really test your system. But much more importantly than that, I think, it's just a great early album to have if you're starting a vinyl collection, and something that I think should be in there. So Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits can be picked up quite cheaply too. Most second-hand record stores are on Discogs. I would select that. Another mammoth artist, and this is Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks from 1976. This was his divorce album. So in that produced some of his best lyrical work, and despite being a kind of slightly angry diatribe on divorce, it's also one of his most relaxing albums in terms of how it plays out. It's regarded as a classic, rightly so. Again, possibly not regarded as one of his greatest. I think for there you're looking at his triumvirate, which was Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde. But for me, for someone who'd never heard Bob Dylan and was looking to get into Bob Dylan and wanted a selection of songs to give them a jump off, also a jump off for the singer-songwriter format, because that's what this is, a singer-songwriter album. Lots of acoustic guitars feature. It's not a heavy rock. It's not a guitar-driven rock album, and nor is it a folk album. It's a singer-songwriter album. So that's why, given he's a genius, and given the thought that he put into this during a tough personal time, and also the fact that it's a good jump off point for the genre, for the singer songwriter genre. Then I think a good starting point is Blood on the Tracks by Bob Dylan. What's next? Impossible for this album not to feature, in my opinion. It's a personal favourite, but also, you know, just a quintessential album to own on vinyl, and it's Rumours by Fleetwood Mac. You know, released in 1976 or 77. It was their second album of this lineup. The first in that lineup with Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks was the self-titled album, Fleetwood Mac from 1975. But this is where they really, they really came to their own. It's in terms of the outpouring of talent of the three key songwriters in the band, which were Stevie Nicks, Christine McVie, and Lindsey Buckingham, and Lindsey Buckingham's guitar work, and also the way they could harness their harmony vocals. Then, despite what sounded like quite a tumultuous time recording this in the studio, you know, cocaine parties, half the band divorcing each other, then there's a reason why so many people own Fleetwood Mac by Rumours, and that is it's just a sensational LP by fantastic musicians, all kind of reaching the pinnacle of their ability to write songs, sing and play at the same time. So despite the band falling apart, it is, in my opinion, you know, the quintessential Fleetwood Mac album. This is one of my prized possessions because it's a reasonably rare double Palace pressing on 45 RPM, mastered by Steve Hoffman and Kevin Gray. And the problem with this pressing is it's so darn good, it makes you wonder whether any of your albums are properly pressed, because it sounds so impressive compared to any other version I've heard of Fleetwood Mac Rumours. So that's you can still get it, I think, online. You may have to get it on import if you live in the UK, but this is the double vinyl 45 RPM of Fleetwood Mac Rumours. Got to be in your top 20 essential first records to buy. Next is a soul legend. It's by Marvin Gaye, and this is Let's Get It On. So this is from 1973, and it was the follow-up to his breakthrough record in an album format, which was What's Get It On. And the reason I've selected this is I think it's just a great album to start a soul collection with. It's laid back. His vocals are, you know, some of the best you'll ever hear. It's one of the best Motown albums, certainly, and so many soul albums have been built, careers have been built on what Marvin Gaye did on Let's Get It On. It's really got to be in the essential list. So next is the 1979 album by a UK band on Factory Records. This is one of only two albums by Joy Division, and this is Unknown Pleasures. So I remember famously reading a story by John Peel in which he said after Joy Division, all he got for 5 years was bands that sounded exactly like Joy Division. So, you know, and there's a certain truth to that. No Joy Division, then there would have been no U2, no Radiohead, no Cure, and all of that new wave phase would have either not existed or sounded entirely different. Make no mistake, it's a somber, down LP in the sense that, you know, Ian Curtis, their late great singer, famously suffered from various health issues and depression, and eventually committed suicide. But in terms of something that just captures, you know, someone's pain, and you know, change the face of independent music, then this album deserves to be in any first 20 albums you buy. So that's Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division. Not one for a cold day when you're feeling down, but certainly something that you'll find yourself listening to again and again with incredible depth to it. So what's next? Probably no surprise that this band feature, again a UK band. It's Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin from 1975. Now, you could have selected, you know, more obviously one of their first four albums, all classic albums in their own right. But the reason I've selected Physical Graffiti is I think this is kind of the opposite of the Beatles. This is when they really locked into themselves as a band and stopped trying to prove themselves. So it's not about ambition or trying to be something. This is about they knew who they were, and they were in a studio, and they just sounded like a cohesive unit. It's an amazing double album. They had the confidence to include demos from earlier in their recording career on here too. It features Kashmir famously, as you probably know, but in terms of something that would start off a vinyl collection in terms of a Zeppelin album, who they were, and also gave you some ideas about rock albums from the 70s and beyond, then I think Physical Graffiti would be the starting point for me. In Zeppelin albums, next is the only greatest hits album to feature in this selection. It's by Madonna, and it's the Immaculate Collection. And this is here because you could convincingly own this album from the 80s. It may be maybe a Michael Jackson or a Bruce Springsteen album as well, but this alone would capture what the 80s were about. Yes, it's glossy, yes, it's overwrought, and yes, it's all about ambition and all about the glitz and glamour that Madonna encapsulates. But it's also got a lot of depth to it. The sequencing's great, and more importantly, the songs are out of this world. So I think that Madonna's Immaculate Collection. This is a double vinyl reissue. Wasn't that expensive actually for a double greatest hits collection, and I think this should grace your 20 essential first albums in the rock and pop era. Madonna's Immaculate Collection. Next is a true genius. It is the 1971 album Blue by Joni Mitchell. This is a fairly early UK pressing of Blue. Played really well. It's really here because it encapsulated the West Coast singer-songwriter genre, and it's probably one of the greatest examples of what that genre involves. It's known as a bedsit album. It's an album to listen to when you're on your own or late at night. And she's in my view a songwriting genius, and this is as close as you'll get to Joni Mitchell in terms of just you and her, because it's mainly acoustic guitar or pared down piano, not much accompaniment, and it's an amazing album. So I think in terms of someone who's gonna represent that West Coast songwriting genre, and also someone who's a songwriting genius and deserves to be in anybody's collection, that's why I would choose Joni Mitchell's Blue, in your first 20 album selection. Joni Mitchell's Blue. Next, something completely different. It's from 1991. This is Loveless by the Scottish band My Bloody Valentine, and this just doesn't sound like any album you've ever heard. There've been albums since this that sound like Loveless, but it is a real unique album, and I heard this many years after it was released, but I can't imagine what it must have been like hearing Loveless in 1991. And that's because so the sound of it is overdriven guitars, but almost made to sound beautiful actually, in terms of this wall of sound. I suppose it was the jump off point for shoegaze, because it's kind of this wall of sound of guitars and then barely audible vocals, but it comes across as kind of a stew of just beautiful music, and it takes many listens to get under that initial sheen of a wall of sound into what's actually happening. There's a lot of layers to Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. So for what it represented culturally, but also just it's such a beautiful album to own. The good news is that it's been reissued, so this was incredibly hard to get in vinyl until it was reissued last year by Kevin Shield, the My Bloody Valentine leader, and he really did pour over quarter-inch analog tapes and do a really good job of reissuing this excellent copy of Loveless. So it'll if you haven't heard Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, you can now get it on vinyl. It'll amaze you, and again, it will give you lots of ideas in terms of how to access shoegaze or independent music that you hadn't previously thought of buying. So Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. What's next then? So this is the only album from the grunge era in the collection, and you might think the obvious choice is Nevermind by Nirvana, but I've chosen 10 by Pearl Jam. and that's because I think that, yes, Nevermind was revolutionary, and yes, that Nevermind will always appear in critics' best of lists, but I think that Pearl Jam are more closely connected to what rock music is, in the sense that there's actually classic rock in here, and you can see the lineage from, you know, even Bad Company through to Pearl Jam and beyond, and so I'm not arguing that whether, you know, Nirvana or Pearl Jam are the better grunge act. I'm just saying that in terms of an initial grunge album to own in your connection, that might give you a jump off point to other subgenres or melodic. This is a more melodic album than Nevermind 2. I think it's more closely connected to songwriting. Alive's on here, of course. Even Flow's on here. I would say there's a bit of personal preference here as well. I prefer Pearl Jam to Nirvana, but I wouldn't argue if you want to substitute. But a grunge album in your collection, in my view, start with Pearl Jam's 10, and you won't go too far on. Another late musician, unfortunately, sadly left us very recently, and that's Tom Petty and the erstwhile Heartbreakers. So this is Damn the Torpedoes from 1979. It's quite an early Backstreet and MCA version of this. I had to wait quite a bit to get this, I think, on import, but it's a fantastic mint copy of it. And this album, they just poured over every note on this album to release something that is, to me, the quintessential Tom Petty album. You could substitute Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run for this, and I wouldn't argue with you. But for me, in terms of a quintessential 70s rock and roll album, great songwriting, really took the time over recording this thing. Here Comes My Girl's on here, Refugee, obviously, Don't Do Me Like That. It's just great radio rock, but incredible depth to it. I think Meg Chapman is an incredible guitarist too. And so Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Damn the Torpedoes, released, I think, in the middle of some real turbulence where, if this LP didn't break for them, they would have been, that would have been the end of their career too. So they felt that pressure, delivered, and this is a sensational album to own on vinyl. It sounds amazing on vinyl too. So I don't know what the reissues sound like, but hunt down, an early copy on Backstreet or MCA of Damn the Torpedoes, and you'll have a fantastic album to start your initial 20 in your collection. This is a US band, indie band, and this is Automatic for the People by R.E.M. So this followed probably their breakthrough album into the mainstream, which was Out of Time. But the reason I've selected Automatic for the People is I think this is their best album, actually, and I think it captures R.E.M., the essence of what R.E.M. are about. It's varied. The songwriting's amazing, and it's just a band at the peak of their powers, both in terms of a unit and their songwriting prowess. This album solely, markedly changed my music taste, because prior to this I was a big rock and metal fan, and this album alone changed that taste. So whilst this isn't a selection of 20 personal preferences, Automatic for the People, is one of my it's certainly an album that changed my views on music. But this encapsulates that era of indie rock, and I think it's a good starting point for R.E.M. It'll also get you listening to some of the earlier acts that influenced R.E.M. From here you may get into Television or Patti Smith. It's got that feel to it. So again, a good jump off point for subgenres would be Automatic for the People by R.E.M. An amazing album, and I think where they really captures who this band was. Another career high LP, which I would definitely recommend in the top 20, would be Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones, from 1971. This was when the Rolling Stones were kicking into a next gear, just when the Beatles had fallen apart. So that competition had gone. I don't know why. I don't know if that's why it's as good as it is. But this, from everything from the Andy Warhol cover to, you know, Brown Sugar, to Moonlit Mail, to Can You Hear Me Knocking. This is, you know, I think that this is potentially, you know, just the best example of a pure rock album. How to sequence it, how to write songs, how to produce. You know, it's close to perfection, and if close to perfection is in the hands of the Rolling Stones, considering how many great albums that they've released, then that can't be a bad thing. Unfortunately, this is a reissue. It isn't a famous Zip cover, but you know, the Rolling Stones reissues, which were a few years ago now, were excellent. So I haven't got an original copy to compare this to, but this version, which was released a couple of years back, sounds amazing. Packaging's good. So to me, one of the quintessential rock albums to own. Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. So the final 3 albums, VC. Next on the list is from 1977, and it's by a US band. This is by Steely Dan, and it's called Asia. So for those who don't know the story of Steely Dan, so they comprised essentially of 2 musicians, so Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. So they started off as brill building songwriters in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and then struck out on their own as a group, Steely Dan. And they had a kind of rotating cadre of musicians that they used. And famously what they did is they spent so much time in the recording studio with multiple session musicians, and that kind of build up over these increasingly complex but fantastic sounding albums in the 70s. And the peak of that really was this 1977 album, Asia. I've got no idea how many musicians are on this, but kind of the cream of the New York the New York music scene on this, and it's just an amazing album. It's so meticulous in terms of the songwriting. The lyrics are amazing, and Steely Dan don't sound like anyone else. When you first hear them, it sounds quite stifling and quite almost middle of the road. But when you really understand what they were doing, which was, you know, groundbreaking studio work, elements of jazz in here too, and jamming. But I wouldn't have liked to have been in a studio with Steely Dan, because I bet they were a nightmare. You know, months and years of recording and then sacking session musicians. But in terms of something that is, I think, quintessential for your collection, an amazing set of songs, will sound great on your system, and is made for vinyl, then I think Asia by Steely Dan should be on your top 20 essential list. 2 albums to go. Next is, I think this guy had to feature on the list somewhere, and that is After the Gold Rush from 1972 by Neil Young. You know, it's an amazing album, one of his true classics. I think it captures him, you know, in the first throes of his post Buffalo Springfield career, where he was really making it. Yes, he had an album before this named Everyone Knows This Is Nowhere that was a great LP, but this really saw him hit the big time, and you know, I think it is an essential album to have in your collection, readily available second hand or reissue on vinyl. And I think it's Neil Young at really the height of his powers, so that's why I think that's a good jump off point for all kinds of rock music, but certainly a good first Neil Young LP to own. So what's the 20th album on the list then? So I thought long and hard about whether to include this because it's such an obvious choice, and I even challenged myself as to whether I was only including it because everybody else would. But when you really think about it, then I think you've got to have Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd on the list. And even if this was never on any other list of the first 20, it's here because of the music. I think that in terms of the album format and the sequencing and the ability of this band to do something truly inspirational for 45 to 50 minutes, then this is an amazing example, and it's on here because it's something you should be listening to if you're starting a vinyl collection, not because it's on lots of other people's lists. So I think, Pink Floyd, I thought about Wish You Were Here, I thought about The Wall, and other albums that could have been included. But I do think that despite how ubiquitous Dark Side of the Moon is, I think that it's essential in your first 20 albums to buy. So that's why it's in there. So there you go then. that is the 20 completed. There are many artists and albums that I missed out of that. You know, there's no Michael Jackson. Prince is one of my favourite artists. He's not in there. No Bruce Springsteen or ZZ Top in there. No Beach Boys. So again, it's not the 20 greatest albums ever made. It's not my 20 personal favourites, but hopefully that provided food for thought for those in the VC community or beyond, for those starting a baseline collection. Love to hear your comments on whether you thought that selection was dreadful, whether you agree with it, disagree with it, or things that I obviously missed, or some of the comments I made. You know, subscribe. Look forward to hearing your comments below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and have a great weekend.